New York, late winter 1992. Outside the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, the cameras are already set up, before the sun's fully out. Reporters stamping their feet against the cold, breath fogging in front of their faces, waiting on a story they already half know the shape of. Somebody's always waiting outside a building when John Gotti's involved. That part never changed, not once, across 3 trials and almost a decade of headlines. They called him the Teflon Don, a nickname that started almost as a joke among prosecutors who couldn't make anything stick to him, and ended up printed on the front page of half the newspapers in the country. 3 trials, 3 acquittals. A man who beat the system so many times that people genuinely started to wonder, half seriously, half not, whether maybe the system simply couldn't touch him. Worth pausing on that nickname for a second. Teflon Don is a story about prosecutors failing, but it got repeated so often it started sounding like a story about Gotti being untouchable. Those aren't the same claim. 3 acquittals in a row isn't proof of genius. It's also consistent with witness intimidation and a jury that got reached, which is exactly what came out later. The legend got built before anyone checked how it actually happened. Inside, the marble corridors of the courthouse were already filling with a strange mix of people who didn't usually share the same room. Federal marshals in dark suits, courtroom sketch artists setting up their pads, a handful of curious retirees who'd taken to following the trial the way some people follow a soap opera, and somewhere among them, quietly, the people who'd actually built this case over years of patient, often tedious work. Nobody outside that small circle of investigators knew, not for certain, how it would end. Gotti had walked before. Plenty of smart people in that building that morning assumed, on some level, that he might walk again. This time felt different, though. You could sense it in the way the marshals moved that morning, in the careful, almost clipped way the lawyers spoke to reporters, none of the usual theater. Something had shifted. Something always shifts, right before the end of something. You just don't always notice it until later, looking back, piecing together which moment was the hinge. So, the real question here, the one worth sitting with, not just skimming past, isn't simply what happened to John Gotti. It's a little stranger than that, a little more uncomfortable. It's this. How does a kid from a cramped, overcrowded apartment, one of 13 children, end up becoming maybe the most photographed criminal in American history? Not the richest mob boss who ever lived. Not even, by most accounts, the smartest. But the most photographed. The most talked about. A gangster who somehow became a kind of folk celebrity, adored by tabloids one week, condemned by federal judges the next, sometimes within the same sentence of the same article. And I'd push back a little on framing this as not even the smartest. By the end of this story, being the most photographed mob boss in American history is arguably what got him convicted for good. So is that really separate from the question of how smart he was? Or is the visibility itself the dumbest decision he ever made, dressed up as charisma? That's where this has to start. Not with the murders. Not yet. With the kid. He was born in 1940 in the South Bronx, but it was Brooklyn and later Queens, the East New York neighborhood first, then Howard Beach once money started coming in, where Gotti really came of age, where the sidewalks and stoops and corner social clubs shaped him into whatever it was he eventually became. Poverty does something to a person. Not always the same thing, not in any predictable or tidy way, but it does something. His father, John Sr., worked sporadically, day labor mostly, never anything steady, and struggled constantly to keep a family of 15 fed and housed. Young John, quick-tempered and restless and sharp in a way that didn't always serve him well, found his footing not in the classroom but out on the street, the way a lot of kids in that world did. Gangs, petty theft, fist fights that started over nothing. A look, a wrong word, $1 owed, and ended in something close to ritual. The whole block watching from stoops and fire escapes, keeping score like it mattered. And in that world, it did. He dropped out of school in his teens, never made it past the 8th grade by most accounts. Most of the men who'd later sit beside him in courtrooms decades on did roughly the same. There's a pattern there, though nobody much likes to dwell on it, least of all the men themselves. By 16, he already had a juvenile record, truancy, assault, petty larceny charges that read now in hindsight almost like the opening chapters of a story everyone already knows the ending to. And here's the thing about that part of New York in those years. Organized crime wasn't some separate, distant institution operating behind closed doors somewhere else. It was woven straight through daily life. The social clubs on the corner, the bookmaking operations tucked behind unmarked doors with a guy out front who knew everyone by name, the loan sharks who somehow knew your business before you did. For a kid like Gotti, hungry, a little reckless, looking for something that felt like respect, the Mafia wasn't a myth. It was just there, down the block, a guy who knew a guy who knew somebody else. There's a particular kind of neighborhood where this happens, and East New York in the 1940s and 50s was exactly that kind of place. Tenement buildings packed tight against each other, laundry strung between fire escapes, the corner candy store doubling as a numbers spot, the way half the candy stores in Brooklyn seemed to in those years. Kids learned the hierarchy early, who you didn't mess with, whose father worked for whom, which guy on the block you nodded to, and which guy you crossed the street to avoid. Gotti, by most accounts from people who knew him then, was already showing the traits that would define him decades later. Fearless to the point of recklessness, quick with his fists, possessed of a kind of magnetic confidence that made other kids fall in around him almost automatically. The way certain personalities just seemed to organize a room without trying. He ran with a local gang for a while, the Fulton-Rockaway Boys, named for the intersection where they congregated, alongside several other young men who'd go on to careers in organized crime themselves, including his own brothers, because that's a detail that sometimes gets lost in the retelling. Gotti wasn't an isolated figure pulled into this world by chance. He had brothers, Gene, Peter, Richard, who followed roughly similar paths. The family producing not one but several men who'd eventually find their way into the Gambino organization. Whatever pulled John toward that life pulled at least some of his siblings too. Environment does that. It doesn't pick favorites. His first real connections to the Gambino crime family came through the neighborhood itself, through small jobs nobody asked too many questions about. Moving stolen goods, running errands, standing somewhere and just being seen standing there. He was arrested multiple times through his late teens and into his 20s. Hijacking, assault, and battery, bookmaking. He did a stretch at Rikers Island in his early 20s that, depending on who you ask, either humbled him a little or hardened him considerably. Maybe both. People rarely reduce that cleanly, no matter how badly we want them to for the sake of a tidy story. I want to flag something here, because the poverty made him explanation only gets you so far. Plenty of kids grew up exactly as poor on the exact same blocks and didn't end up running a crime family. Environment explains the opportunity. It doesn't explain why Gotti specifically took it with both hands while his neighbors didn't. That part's harder to pin down, and the documentary instinct to smooth it into one tidy cause and effect story is worth being suspicious of. Somewhere in the middle of all that, in 1958, he married Victoria DiGiorgio. She was 17. He was barely older. They'd go on to have 5 children together, and whatever else gets said about the man, and plenty gets said, by most accounts, he remained married to her for the rest of his life, through everything that followed. That's worth pausing on for a second, honestly. The public image was all suits and headlines and courtroom theatrics, but there was a whole separate, ordinary domestic life running parallel to it the entire time. A house in Howard Beach, birthdays. A son, Frank, killed tragically in 1980 at age 12, struck by a car while riding his minibike. A loss that, by accounts from people close to the family, affected Gotti more deeply and more permanently than almost anything else in his life, criminal or otherwise. Grief doesn't check whether you're a gangster before it arrives. What's certain, though, is this. By his mid-20s, Gotti had built himself a reputation. Violent, certainly, that was never in question, but also reliable, useful, loyal in a world where loyalty functioned as its own currency, sometimes the only currency that actually mattered when everything else got stripped away. That reputation eventually put him in front of Agnello Della Croce. Della Croce, Neil, to the people who knew him well enough to use it, was underboss of the Gambino family, a serious man, old school in the way that phrase gets used almost reverently inside mob circles even now. Disciplined, quiet, not flashy in the slightest. The kind of figure who commanded a room through silence as much as through anything he ever actually said out loud. He'd been around since the earliest days of the modern Mafia's structure, had survived purges and shifting alliances that ended other men's careers, and carried himself with the kind of restraint that comes from having seen exactly how fast things can fall apart for someone who talks too much or moves too visibly. Gotti, by contrast, was loud, magnetic, impossible to ignore even when you wanted to. On paper, the two of them shouldn't have worked together at all, and yet something about Gotti's hunger appealed to the older man. Maybe Della Croce saw potential nobody else had bothered to look for. Maybe he saw a younger, rougher version of himself reflected back, the way older men sometimes do when they meet someone who reminds them what ambition used to feel like before it calcified into something more careful. Whatever the reason, Della Croce took an active hand in Gotti's development, vouching for him at moments that mattered, smoothing over conflicts that might otherwise have ended a less protected man's career early. It was, by most accounts, something close to an actual mentorship, not just a transactional relationship between a useful soldier and a convenient patron, but something with real loyalty running both directions. Real loyalty running both directions is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and it's worth remembering how this organization actually treated loyalty later on. Gravano flipped. Gotti himself had Castellano killed for being in the way. Calling this mentorship real loyalty assumes a stability that the rest of the script spends the next hour disproving. Under Della Croce's wing, Gotti rose steadily. He proved himself first through hijackings at JFK Airport, a remarkably lucrative, almost industrial-scale operation in those years, with trucks full of cargo disappearing before they ever reached their intended destinations. It was dangerous, high-pressure work. It required real nerve, careful coordination, and the willingness to look a federal agent dead in the eye and lie without so much as a flicker. Gotti had all of that in spades, apparently, even as a young man. Picture it for a second. JFK, in the mid-1960s, wasn't yet the sprawling, security-saturated complex it is now. Cargo areas sat relatively exposed, trucks idling at loading docks with drivers who could be talked to, paid off, or simply intimidated into looking the other way for 10 minutes. Gotti's crew specialized in exactly this, identifying which shipments were worth the risk, which drivers were soft, which routes offered the cleanest exit, furs, electronics, once, famously, an entire truckload of razor blades that turned out to be worth far more on the black market than anyone outside the business would have guessed. It wasn't glamorous work, not in the way later mythology would paint it. It was logistics, really. Criminal logistics, executed with the same kind of planning a legitimate shipping company might use, just inverted entirely toward theft. He was arrested for hijacking in 1968 and did time at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He came out, as these things often go, more connected than when he'd gone in. Prison functioning less as a deterrent in that world, and more as an unofficial networking circuit, grim as that sounds when you say it plainly. By the early 1970s, Gotti had become a made man, formally inducted into the Gambino family in a ceremony steeped in ritual and blood oath. Not a foot soldier anymore, someone with an actual future inside the organization, and his star kept climbing. He ran his own crew. He earned consistently, reliably, in ways that impressed the people above him, sometimes through brute efficiency, and sometimes through a kind of natural charisma that didn't quite fit the stereotype of what a mobster was supposed to look or sound like. People liked him, genuinely liked him, in a lot of cases, even people who probably should have known better than to let themselves. There's one episode from 1973 worth lingering on, because it says something about how loyalty actually functioned inside that world, beneath all the abstraction. Carlo Gambino's nephew, Manny Gambino, had been kidnapped and murdered, allegedly by an Irish hood named James McBratney. Carlo Gambino wanted revenge, and the job of delivering it fell partly to Gotti. McBratney was shot dead in a Staten Island bar in May of 1973 in front of witnesses in a way that left fairly obvious fingerprints, figuratively and otherwise, pointing back toward the Gambino organization. Gotti was arrested, eventually pled to attempted manslaughter, and served roughly 2 years at Greenhaven Correctional Facility. But the act itself, carried out at real personal risk on Carlo Gambino's behalf, cemented something important. It told the people who mattered that Gotti would do the difficult, exposed work without flinching, without needing to be asked twice. That kind of reputation, once earned, tends to compound. By the early 1980s, Gotti held the rank of Capo, overseeing his own crew out of the Bergin Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. A modest storefront from the outside. Nothing glamorous about it at all. Folding chairs, a coffee pot, the smell of cigar smoke that never quite left the walls. But inside that unremarkable little building, decisions were being made that would eventually ripple through the entire organization and then through the entire country's understanding of what organized crime even looked like. Then everything changed. The way it always does in stories like this one, suddenly, and then never quite the same again. Paul Castellano had become boss of the Gambino family after Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, effectively skipping over Della Croce, who many within the family believed deserved the position far more, who certainly held the loyalty of the old guard, the street-level guys who'd come up through hijackings and gambling rackets the same rough way Gotti had. Castellano was a different breed entirely, more businessman than gangster in a lot of ways. He lived in a sprawling mansion on Staten Island that people had taken to calling the White House, whether ironically or not, depending entirely on who was telling the story that day. He kept his distance from the rougher street-level operations, drug trafficking especially, and that distance over time created real friction. Not the dramatic kind, the slow, simmering kind that builds quietly for years before anyone names it out loud. Real friction is a soft way to describe what ends with Castellano shot dead outside a steakhouse. I think it's worth naming plainly here before the script gets there. This wasn't a slow boardroom disagreement that boiled over. Gotti had a sitting boss murdered without the commission's approval, which, by the Mafia's own rules, was a massive violation. The friction framing makes what comes next sound more inevitable and more justified than it actually was. Castellano had explicitly forbidden family members from dealing drugs. The stated penalty officially was death, no exceptions, no negotiations. And yet narcotics trafficking was happening anyway, quietly, among capos and soldiers who saw the money on the table and simply couldn't talk themselves out of reaching for it. Gotti's own crew was implicated in exactly this, as it would later come out in painstaking detail. There existed, for a while, an uneasy arrangement where Della Croce shielded certain members from Castellano's potential wrath, a kind of buffer, a peacekeeping function that only worked, as these things tend to, for as long as Della Croce remained alive to actually perform it. There's another layer to this worth mentioning, because it shaped how things unfolded. Castellano had also grown increasingly distant from the street-level soldiers in general, holed up in that Staten Island mansion, surrounded more by lawyers and accountants than by the kind of old-world capos who'd built the organization decades earlier. He rarely visited the social clubs, rarely showed his face where the actual earners spent their days. To men like Gotti, steeped in a culture that placed enormous weight on visible respect, on a boss who walked among his people, Castellano's remoteness read as something close to contempt. Whether that perception was fair to Castellano personally is a separate question. Perception, again, often did the heavy lifting in that world. He died of cancer in December 1985. And the funeral itself, just days before the Sparks Steakhouse hit, became its own small piece of theatre. Gotti reportedly didn't attend, citing his own health, though more cynical observers at the time read it as calculated distance, positioning himself away from any obvious connection to whatever might happen next. Within the family, men who'd spent years navigating between Della Croce's loyalists and Castellano's inner circle suddenly found themselves without the one figure who'd kept the peace between those two camps. And just like that, within days, not weeks, the buffer was simply gone. Tensions that had been quietly simmering for years finally boiled over completely. Castellano, it turned out, knew about the drug dealing happening inside Gotti's crew. Worse than that, word reached Gotti and his closest associates that Castellano might be preparing to take action, demotions at minimum, quite possibly something far more permanent, against the members implicated in narcotics trafficking. Whether that fear was entirely accurate or partly inflated by Gotti's own simmering paranoia and ambition, remains something historians and former associates still argue about decades later. But the perception alone was enough to set things in motion. In that world, perception often mattered just as much as fact, sometimes more. So Gotti moved, decisively, and without much room left for second guessing. December 16th, 1985. Sparks Steakhouse, Midtown Manhattan, East 46th Street, just off 2nd Avenue. A cold evening, the kind where steam visibly rises off the sidewalk grates and everyone's collar is turned up against the wind. Castellano arrived for what he believed, right up until the moment he didn't, was a routine business dinner. He stepped out of his car onto the sidewalk. Gunmen, operating, investigators would later determine conclusively on Gotti's direct orders, opened fire almost immediately. Castellano was killed instantly, along with his driver and presumed successor Thomas Bellotti, who never even made it out of the car door fully. Gotti himself reportedly drove past the scene afterward, just to see it with his own eyes, to confirm it, personally, rather than simply trust a phone call or a second-hand account. That single detail tells you something real about the man, never quite satisfied with reports relayed to him, always needing to witness the thing himself, up close, in the flesh. It was a brazen, almost theatrical act of violence. Public. Conducted on a busy Manhattan street during the holiday season, with shoppers and pedestrians moving past just blocks away, completely unaware. The Mafia, as an institution, simply didn't operate that way. Not openly, not with that kind of visibility attached to it. Hits were supposed to be quiet, discreet, handled in back alleys or empty lots or the trunk of a car somewhere far from witnesses. This was neither quiet nor discreet, and everyone in the underworld noticed immediately. But it worked in the most basic sense of that word. Within days, Gotti had effectively seized control of the Gambino family, the largest, wealthiest, and arguably most powerful of New York's so-called five families. He was 45 years old, and almost overnight, he had become one of the most powerful organized crime figures anywhere in the country. Most bosses before him had understood something instinctively, almost as an article of faith passed down through generations. Stay invisible. Keep your name out of the papers entirely if you can manage it. Let the lawyers and the front men and the legitimate-seeming business associates absorb whatever public attention came their way, while the real operation continued quietly from the shadows. That was the model, had been the model, more or less, for decades. Gotti tore that model apart without, it seems, much of a second thought. He wore impeccably tailored suits, double-breasted, often custom-made, paired with silk ties and pocket squares that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. He had a particular, well-documented fondness for Brioni. Reporters started calling him a snappy dresser, then later a genuine fashion icon, which is a strange thing to call a man who had recently orchestrated a murder outside a midtown steakhouse. But there it is, printed in black and white. Image has its own peculiar gravity. It pulls people in regardless of what's actually underneath it, regardless of what they'd find if they looked closer. He held court most days outside the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, greeting onlookers personally, occasionally signing autographs. Autographs for the head of a criminal organization under constant and intensive federal surveillance, as though he was some kind of legitimate celebrity rather than a man orchestrating extortion rackets across half the city's unionized industries. And in a strange, uncomfortable way, that's precisely what he'd become. Crowds gathered outside that club just to catch a glimpse of him. People wanted to see him, wanted to stand near him even just for a passing moment, the way you might wait outside a stage door. Tourists occasionally would wander down Mulberry Street specifically hoping to catch sight of him, a strange kind of pilgrimage, treating a working mob headquarters like a minor landmark. Local restaurant owners reportedly enjoyed a small bump in business on days he was known to be around, the curious stopping in for a coffee or a plate of pasta just to extend their proximity to the spectacle a little longer. None of this is the behavior of a man trying to stay hidden. It's closer, honestly, to the behavior of someone who'd convinced himself that being seen and being powerful were the same thing. That the crowd outside the club was evidence of his strength rather than, as it eventually proved to be, a slow-motion liability accumulating in plain sight. Media coverage only intensified that mystique further. Glossy magazine profiles, television specials dedicated entirely to his rise, a kind of fascination bordering on open admiration, however uncomfortable that fact might be to sit with now, decades removed from it. America has always carried a complicated, somewhat romantic relationship with its outlaws. The gunslinger mythology runs deep and old in the culture, and Gotti, whether consciously or not, slotted neatly into that long tradition. Confident, defiant, untouchable, or at least convincingly so for a remarkably long stretch of time. And the courtroom acquittals did more to build that myth than almost anything else could have. In 1986, federal prosecutor Diane Giacalone brought a sprawling racketeering case against Gotti, built around the RICO statute that had been designed, in theory, to dismantle organizations exactly like the Gambino family by treating the whole enterprise as a single criminal conspiracy. It was an ambitious case, years in preparation, and it should have, by any reasonable measure, ended Gotti's career outright. It didn't. The trial dragged on for months. Key witnesses recanted their testimony or simply vanished under circumstances that always seemed to raise more questions than anyone could satisfactorily answer. There were allegations, never fully proven but persistent enough to linger in the public imagination for years afterward, that at least one juror had been compromised, paid off through an intermediary to hold out for acquittal regardless of the evidence presented. In March of 1987, the jury came back with not guilty verdicts across the board. Gotti walked out of that Brooklyn courthouse to a small crowd of well-wishers and reporters, grinning, straightening his tie for the cameras like a man who'd just won something far more ordinary than a federal racketeering case. Then, in 1990, came another case, this one stemming from an incident in 1986, when a union electrician named John O'Connor had been beaten outside a restaurant, allegedly on Gotti's orders, after a dispute over restaurant renovation work that bypassed O'Connor's union. Witnesses who'd initially cooperated with investigators began changing their accounts on the stand. One key witness, Romuald Piesik, who'd been assaulted in an unrelated 1989 incident allegedly connected to the case, suddenly couldn't recall details he'd previously described with total clarity to a grand jury. "I don't remember," delivered flatly, again and again, became something close to a running joke among reporters covering the trial. Except nobody was really laughing, because everyone in that courtroom understood exactly what was happening and exactly why nobody could prove it. Gotti walked again. The press, predictably, had a field day. Some newspapers ran the Teflon Don nickname practically as a formal title at that point, like it belonged on his driver's license. By the late 1980s, he stood at the absolute peak of his power and influence. The Gambino family was thriving financially across nearly every avenue available to it. Construction rackets that touched half the major projects going up across the city, waste management contracts, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, extortion schemes running through dozens of unionized industries from concrete to garment work. Gotti himself lived extraordinarily well, dressed even better, and seemed, to outside observers anyway, to exist completely beyond the practical reach of American law enforcement. But here's the uncomfortable truth quietly buried underneath all that glamour and swagger and tabloid adoration. The very thing that had made Gotti into a legend was also, slowly and almost imperceptibly, eating away at the foundation beneath him. Every boss before him had understood instinctively, almost as a survival reflex, that visibility itself was a liability in this line of work. Survival in organized crime depended entirely on operating below the surface, avoiding scrutiny wherever possible, letting the actual machinery of the operation run quietly in the background while law enforcement chased shadows somewhere else entirely. Gotti inverted that whole philosophy completely, almost defiantly. He courted the spotlight. He seemed, at certain moments, to genuinely need it the way some people need oxygen. And the FBI noticed. Of course they noticed. How could anyone not? Surveillance on Gotti intensified dramatically through the back half of the 1980s. Wiretaps placed with painstaking legal care. Listening devices planted in cars, in private apartments, even reportedly inside a tailor shop he frequented regularly for fittings. The federal government poured enormous, sustained resources into building a case that could finally hold up under scrutiny. One that wouldn't simply dissolve, the way the earlier prosecutions had, under the weight of intimidated witnesses or quietly compromised jurors. Agents involved in the operation later described the work as something closer to obsession than a standard investigation. Months spent parked in unmarked vans on quiet Queens streets, logging who came and went from the Bergin Club, cross-referencing license plates, building out an organizational chart that grew more detailed by the week. There's a particular kind of patience required for that work, the willingness to sit through hours of nothing. A man buying coffee, a man complaining about traffic, waiting for the handful of minutes that might actually matter. The bug eventually placed in the apartment above the Ravenite would prove to be the single most consequential piece of that patience, though nobody involved at the time could have known exactly how consequential it would turn out to be years down the line. Meanwhile, inside the organization itself, something else entirely was happening. Quieter than the surveillance, more corrosive in its own slow way. Not everyone within the Gambino family was thrilled with Gotti's particular style of leadership. The old-school members, The ones who'd come up under Carlo Gambino, steeped in that earlier generation's deep ethos of discretion and quiet, watched Gotti's constant media appearances with something closer to genuine dread than admiration. He was making the entire family a target, not just himself. Drawing intense law enforcement attention onto everyone connected to him in any way, every soldier and capo and loosely affiliated associate who now found themselves under a microscope they hadn't personally asked for and certainly hadn't agreed to. There was resentment too, simmering quietly beneath the surface, over money, over who was earning what, over decisions Gotti made unilaterally that affected men who had no say in them whatsoever. Power, concentrated too visibly and too completely in one man, tends to generate exactly this kind of friction eventually. It's almost inevitable if you look at the history closely enough. It happens again and again. Some of that resentment came from a simpler place too. The sense among older capos that the family's traditions, the ones built carefully over generations, the very ones that had kept the organization functioning quietly for decades, were being treated as optional by a boss who seemed more interested in his own profile than in the institution itself. There's a particular kind of insult in that culture, in watching someone who's supposed to embody discipline instead behave like he's auditioning for a magazine cover. Whispers like that don't always reach the boss directly. They circulate underneath him, in barbershops and back rooms, building into something that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to manage. The spotlight that had made Gotti into a kind of celebrity was, slowly and then very suddenly indeed, becoming the precise instrument of his undoing. And the man who would ultimately help bring it all crashing down was someone Gotti had trusted deeply, someone close. Closer, in fact, than almost anyone else in his life. Salvatore, Sammy the Bull. Gravano had served as Gotti's underboss, his right hand in the most literal sense, a man who had participated directly in the Castellano hit and in dozens of other violent acts across his decades inside the organization. Gravano was, by his own later sworn admission, connected to 19 murders over the course of his career. 19. That single number alone tells you something about the world we're really discussing here. But by the early 1990s, Gravano found himself growing increasingly disillusioned with the man he'd once served so loyally. He'd grown wealthy under Gotti's leadership, certainly, but he'd also grown wary of Gotti's escalating recklessness, wary of the mounting legal pressure closing in from every direction, wary, perhaps most of all, of overheard conversations in which Gotti seemed to privately blame him, Gravano specifically, for various operational failures that weren't entirely his fault. Conversations Gravano was never meant to hear in the first place. The FBI had been recording extensively at the Ravenite, specifically in an apartment situated above the club itself, where Gotti often met with his top associates, believing, quite wrongly as it turned out, that the space was secure from outside ears. It wasn't secure at all. Federal agents had bugged it thoroughly, methodically, over an extended period. And on those recordings, Gravano heard Gotti discussing him in terms that felt less like loyalty and considerably more like a man being quietly positioned for eventual elimination, should circumstances ever require it. That's not paranoia for what it's worth. That's simply how the life worked, day to day, beneath all the suits and the swagger. Everyone eventually became expendable to everyone else. What makes Gravano's eventual decision land with such weight, looking back, is how unlikely it would have seemed to anyone watching from outside even a year earlier. This was not a peripheral figure looking for an exit ramp. He'd been Gotti's closest confidant, present at the Castellano hit itself, a man whose entire identity for decades had been built around the code he was about to abandon. Prosecutors, when they first approached him, reportedly didn't expect much. People in his position rarely flipped. Not at that level, not after that much blood. But something in those overheard recordings, hearing his own boss discuss him with what felt like cold calculation rather than loyalty, seems to have broken something loose that had held for 30 years. In 1991, facing the very real possibility of his own life sentence after being indicted alongside Gotti on murder and racketeering charges, Gravano made a decision that would have been almost unthinkable in earlier decades of Mafia history. He agreed to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors, to testify openly in court, to break completely and irrevocably the sacred code of omerta, the vow of silence that had supposedly bound men like him for generations before he ever came along. The deal itself was almost as remarkable as the decision behind it. In exchange for his testimony, Gravano received a reduced sentence, 5 years despite his own admitted involvement in 19 murders, along with entry into the federal witness protection program. He'd eventually leave that program too, resurface under his own name, write a book, and end up arrested again years later on drug trafficking charges in Arizona. But that's a different story, one that unfolds well after Gotti's own fate had already been sealed. Let's just sit with that number for a second instead of moving past it. 19 murders. 5 years. That's the actual price of putting Gotti away, and it's easy to let the narrative momentum villain finally gets caught carry you past how uncomfortable that trade is. The system didn't defeat the code of silence through superior justice. It just found someone willing to sell out the one rule for a better deal than the rule itself offered. It's genuinely hard to overstate how significant that initial decision was. The entire mythology of the Mafia, its whole self-image, rested on that silence, on the deep-seated idea that no matter the pressure, no matter the personal cost, you simply didn't talk. Ever. Gravano talking wasn't just one man's individual betrayal of one boss. It was a crack running straight through the foundation of the entire institution, visible to everyone watching. The 1992 trial that followed was, in many real ways, unlike anything that had come before in Gotti's long and complicated history with the American justice system. Federal prosecutors had clearly learned hard lessons from their previous failures. They sequestered the jury this time around, took extraordinary, almost obsessive precautions against any possibility of tampering or intimidation. And, crucially, they had Gravano. Gravano, who could speak with devastating granular specificity about murders, about long-running conspiracies, about specific conversations that placed Gotti directly and unambiguously at the center of decades of sustained criminal activity. The wiretap recordings from that apartment above the Ravenite played a crucial role too. Gotti's own voice, captured discussing criminal business with a casualness that, played back aloud in a federal courtroom, sounded almost unbelievably damning to everyone present. You could hear in those recordings the very same confidence that had once made him a tabloid celebrity now working with total precision against him. The trial itself unfolded over several tense weeks. Evidence piled up steadily. Financial records, surveillance footage, the wiretap recordings, and above everything else, Gravano's testimony, delivered with the flat, almost clinical detail of a man who had finally decided that self-preservation mattered more to him than the old code he'd once sworn, with his hand and his blood to uphold without question. The courtroom itself, by accounts from journalists who covered every session, carried a strange charge that earlier Gotti trials hadn't quite had. Earlier proceedings had almost felt at times like theater the defendant himself was directing. Gotti glancing toward reporters, exchanging looks with supporters in the gallery, performing a kind of unbothered confidence for whoever was watching. This time felt different from the opening statements onward. The jury, sequestered and shielded from outside contact, couldn't be reached the way previous juries allegedly had been. Gotti's lawyers, led by Bruce Cutler, a defense attorney whose theatrical combative style had become almost as famous as his client across the previous trials, found themselves working with noticeably less room to maneuver. Judge I. Leo Glasser, presiding, had taken the unusual step of removing Cutler from the case entirely before testimony even began, ruling that his closeness to Gotti and his alleged associates created a conflict the court couldn't ignore. It was a blow Gotti hadn't anticipated, losing the lawyer who'd helped engineer 2 previous acquittals, replaced by Albert Krieger, a respected but less flamboyant attorney parachuting into a case already in motion. Then came Gravano. He took the stand over multiple days, walking jurors through decades of organizational structure, financial arrangements, and violence with a steadiness that unsettled even seasoned courtroom observers. He described the planning behind the Castellano hit in granular detail: who stood where, who carried what, the precise sequence of events outside Sparks' Steakhouse that December evening. He wasn't performing remorse, particularly. He was simply laying it out, methodically, the way a contractor might walk an inspector through blueprints. That flatness, oddly, seemed to carry more weight with the jury than dramatic testimony might have. There was nothing to disbelieve, nothing theatrical to poke holes in. Just a man describing, in plain language, exactly how the machine had worked from the inside. Prosecutors paired that testimony with the Ravenite recordings, playing portions aloud in court, Gotti's own voice, captured mid-conversation, discussing business in terms that left very little room for alternate interpretation. Jurors sat with headphones at points, listening directly, watching transcripts scroll past on shared screens. There's something almost uncomfortable about hearing a defendant's own voice used against him that directly. Not a witness's account of what he supposedly said, but the actual recording, his actual cadence and phrasing, presented without filter. It closed off the kind of reasonable doubt arguments that had worked so effectively in earlier trials. On April 2, 1992, the jury returned its verdict after deliberating. Guilty. On every single count. Murder, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, illegal gambling. All of it. There would be no acquittal this time around, no triumphant headline calling him untouchable. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered, smaller than in previous years, but still present, still loyal in whatever strange way crowds like that remain loyal, fell quiet as word of the verdict spread. The Teflon, it turned out, had simply been waiting all along for the right combination of hard evidence and personal betrayal to finally peel away completely. I gently push back on simply been waiting all along. It makes the conviction sound like an inevitability, like the truth was always going to surface on its own timeline. It wasn't inevitable. It took a sequestered jury, a disqualified defense attorney, and one specific man deciding to break 30 years of silence. Change any one of those 3 things, and we might be telling a very different story right now. Gotti received a sentence of life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. Full stop. He was transferred shortly afterward to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, one of the most restrictive, isolated facilities in the entire federal system, where he ended up spending much of his remaining years in near total solitary confinement. 23 hours a day, by most accounts, in a cell roughly the size of a small bathroom. No phone calls beyond a tightly limited schedule, no more tailored suits, no more Brioni, just a standard-issue jumpsuit, and the particular silence of a place built specifically to strip away whatever made a man feel like himself. A stark, almost jarring contrast to the man who had once held court outside social clubs, surrounded by admirers, cameras flashing in his direction. This contrast, tailored suits to standard-issue jumpsuit, is the kind of beat documentaries reach for almost automatically, and it works, but it's also doing some quiet moral lifting. It frames Marion as the tragedy of the story. Worth remembering, this is also just what the federal government does to anyone convicted of multiple murders. The irony isn't that it happened to Gotti specifically, it's that it took this long. His appeals continued for years, handled in part by his daughter Victoria, who became a public face for the family during this period, and the case drew its own steady stream of attention even from behind prison walls, documentaries, books, a television movie or two. The legend, in other words, didn't simply stop the moment the cell door closed. If anything, confinement seemed to deepen the mythology rather than puncture it, the way distance and silence often do for figures the public has already decided to find fascinating. He developed throat cancer while incarcerated, diagnosed in the late 1990s. Treatment was limited, the disease aggressive, and by 2000 he'd been transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, a facility built to house inmates with serious medical needs. He died there on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. His funeral, held days later in Queens, drew a procession of mourners and onlookers substantial enough to require police management of the crowds. One final gathering, in a strange way, echoing all those crowds that used to form outside the Ravenite just to catch a glimpse of him walking past. The man who had dominated tabloid headlines for nearly a full decade slipped away, in the end, almost quietly within the walls that held him, even as the public reaction outside those walls remained anything but quiet. There's something genuinely worth sitting with in that contrast. The sheer loudness of the life set against the relative silence of the death, and then that one last loud echo at the very end. So what do we actually make of him now, looking back across all these decades, well past the trials and the tabloid covers and that cold evening outside a steakhouse on East 46th Street? Was John Gotti a criminal mastermind? A man who clawed his way methodically to the very top of one of the most powerful crime organizations in American history through sheer force of will and carefully calculated violence? Or was he, in the final analysis, his own worst enemy? A man whose deep hunger for attention, for celebrity, for exactly the kind of spotlight every smarter predecessor had so carefully avoided, ultimately handed law enforcement everything they needed to take him down for good. Maybe it isn't really an either-or question at all. Maybe it's both things at once, tangled together in a way that simply refuses to resolve neatly, no matter how badly we might want it to for the sake of a clean ending. The same charisma that built his entire empire also exposed it, piece by piece, to exactly the wrong people. The same visibility that made him beloved by tabloid readers across the country also made him an irresistible, practically unavoidable target for federal prosecutors who had grown thoroughly tired, after years of failed cases and embarrassing acquittals, of watching him walk free again and again. I'll actually take a side here instead of leaving it both and. Mastermind doesn't hold up well against the record. A mastermind doesn't get caught on his own wiretaps in his own clubhouse 3 separate times, saying things a first-year defense attorney would have told him never to say out loud. The acquittals look like genius for exactly as long as you ignore jury tampering. Take that away, and what's left is a guy whose need to be seen was, eventually, the whole case against him. His rise fundamentally changed how the broader American public understood organized crime as a whole, transforming a world that had operated for decades in calculated, almost bureaucratic obscurity into something that increasingly resembled spectacle. Reality television before reality television really existed in any formal sense, in a strange and somewhat unsettling way. And that particular shift outlived him by a long stretch. The ongoing fascination with mob culture across American film, television, and endless documentaries, this one very much included, owes something, whether we're entirely comfortable admitting it or not, to the particular brand of celebrity Gotti so deliberately cultivated for himself. The Sopranos, premiering not long after his conviction, drew explicitly on the tension between old-school mob discretion and a newer, more exposed, more media-saturated criminal world. A tension Gotti himself had basically embodied in real life before any television writer thought to dramatize it. The Gambino family continued on after his conviction, naturally. Organized crime families rarely simply vanish overnight, no matter how hard law enforcement tries to dismantle them. But it was a noticeably diminished thing by then, weakened considerably by the very prosecution that Gotti's relentless visibility had practically invited in the first place. His son, John Gotti Jr., made an attempt at stepping into leadership not long after, but the family's overall power and internal cohesion had already been substantially eroded by Gravano's devastating testimony, by the wiretaps, by the relentless federal pressure that years of unwanted media attention had practically guaranteed from the start. John Jr. himself would later face his own string of prosecutions, several ending in hung juries, before eventually stepping away from that world entirely and, by his own account, choosing a different path for his children than the one his father had walked. And yet, here we are, still talking about him decades later, still drawn, in some uncomfortable and not entirely explicable way, to the contradictions at the center of the man. The violence sitting right alongside the vanity, the brutality alongside an undeniable charm. A man who ordered murders with cold, calculated precision and also seemed, somehow, to genuinely enjoy being looked at, being known, being, in whatever twisted sense applies here, famous. Maybe that's the real legacy when you strip everything else away. Not the murders themselves, not the trials, not even the eventual conviction that finally ended it all. But the question he leaves behind, unresolved and more than a little uncomfortable to sit with. What does it actually mean that a country built partly on the mythology of outlaws and rebels found itself, for one strange and intense decade, genuinely captivated by a man who broke the most basic rule of his own world: stay hidden, stay quiet, and somehow, for a while at least, made that rule-breaking look almost like power itself? It wasn't power in the end. Not really. Not when you look closely enough. It was exposure, plain and simple. And exposure, sooner or later, always finds its way to the surface.